Hi everyone, this is Miss Perenboom, and we are going to be looking at Learning Target 7C, Part 2, and today we're going to be talking about compound interest. So yesterday we talked about simple interest, which is when you calculate the interest at the very end of your investment. So that could mean if you have money in a bank account and you're earning 4% simple interest, at the end of however many years you've kept the money in the account, that 4% would be calculated all at the same time. Compound interest, on the other hand, is interest that's earned on both the principal and on any interest that has already been earned. So what that means is that if I was going to, for example, deposit $200 into a savings account that earns an annual interest rate of 3.5%, and it gets compounded annually, that means at the end of that first year that I put those $200 in that account, at the end of the first year, I get to calculate 3.5% interest and add it into the account. So then my account is no longer just holding $200, it's holding $200 plus a little bit of interest. So at the end of the second year, when I go to calculate 3.5% interest again, I have a little bit more money in the account that's earning interest. So essentially your interest can earn interest when you have compound interest. So it's usually a little bit more money in the end, but again, it kind of depends on what your interest rate is as far as how much more money it gives you. So using that first example of $200 getting 3.5% interest being compounded annually, how much will you have in your account after 2 years? Okay, so my recommendation would be to use a table to keep track of your work, because essentially what's happening here is you have multiple markups. You're going to calculate 3.5% interest and add it back into the account. And then you're going to calculate 3.5% interest again, and so on. So I would set it up something like this, where I'm keeping track of how many years have passed. I'm keeping track of my starting balance at the beginning of each year. Leave a little bit of room for you to figure out, to show your work, to write down what your new interest amount is, and then to find that ending balance. So when I deposit $200, that's my starting balance. So after a year has gone by, I've started with $200, I'm going to calculate 3.5% interest on that $200. Now, you could set up a proportion, or you can divide that percent by 100 to turn it into a decimal. And so when I do that and I move the decimal twice to the left, that gives me 0.035. And I can multiply that by my starting amount, which was 200. So if you have a calculator out in front of you, you can confirm that I'm getting the right numbers here. But when we multiply those, that will give you approximately $7 in interest. And so then my ending balance is I still have the $200 I deposited plus the $7 of interest, so now I'm up to $207. So now when I start year 2, I'm now starting with $207. So see, we've gone up in our principal amount. I'm going to now calculate 3.5% interest of that starting amount, so 0.035 times 207. And this time I'm going to earn a little bit extra interest. So I'm earning $7.25. And so my ending balance at the end of that second year would be this $207 plus the new interest that I've earned for a total of $214.25. Okay, so again, it's a good idea to set up a table to keep track of your work because you're doing multiple calculations. You're calculating that percent interest at the end of each period of time, in this case at the end of each year, and you have to add that back on, and you need that ending balance before you can do the next row of work. Okay, let's take a look at another one here. You deposit $550 into a savings account that earns an annual interest rate of 2% that's compounded monthly. How much will you have in your account after 6 months? Okay, now one of the things I want to point out to you here is that it's telling us that it's being compounded monthly. So your interest rate, though, is given to you as an annual rate. So you earn 2% over the course of a year. However, that's getting broken up into a little bit each month. So you don't get 2% each month. That would be awesome if you did, but unfortunately you don't. You get 2% total throughout the year. So what that means is that we have to divvy up that 2% over the course of the entire year by month. And so since there's 12 months in the year, we're going to split that out equally. So 2% divided by 12. And so if I think of 2% as 0.02, because that's the decimal equivalent that I'll be using in my calculations, when I divide that by 12, I actually get a repeating decimal here. So I'm going to round it to approximately 0.00167. Okay, so that's how much interest. So that would be like that would be 0.167% each month, right? And as a decimal, when we move the decimal twice to the left, we get 0.00167 to use in our calculations. Okay, so now when I set up my table, it's going to look the same as our last one. The only difference is now I'm keeping track of months over here instead of years. So I deposited $550 into this account, so that's my starting balance. And at the end of that first month, I get to take this percent of interest. So I'm going to multiply 0.00167 times that 550, and that's going to give me about 92 cents in interest. So now my ending balance, I still have the 550 plus the 92 cents, so now I'm up to $550.92. And just like in the last example, that ending balance at the end of month 1 becomes my starting balance for month 2. So now I'm going to calculate that same percent of interest, right, after the second month, and I'm calculating it off of this starting amount of $550.92. Now, when we multiply that out, it gives us a pretty long decimal, and so remember we always round to the nearest hundredth, so that's the second digit after the decimal. And so in this case, it ends up rounding to, again, 92 cents. So that amount seems to have stayed kind of the same, which is okay. Eventually, it'll become a little bit more. All right, so we'll add that back onto the starting balance for month 2, bringing us up to a total of $551.84. And again, our ending balance here becomes the next month's starting balance. And so we continue this pattern. So I'm going to calculate my 0.167% of my starting balance. Okay, that's going to give me, again, 92 cents. I wasn't able to round up yet. It's still, that third digit is still less than 5, so we keep it at 92 cents. And when I add that back onto the starting balance here of $551.84, now we're at $552.76. That becomes my next starting balance. I'm going to multiply by my percent interest again, and this time still have 92 cents in interest. Add it back on. Now we're up to $553.68. That again becomes my next starting balance. Calculate my percent interest for that month, and it's still 92 cents. Adding it back in, we're now up to $554.60. And for month 6, take that starting balance again, calculate our percent interest, and finally we get to round up. We're at 93 cents now in interest. So adding that back on to our starting balance here, we now end with a total of $555.53. Okay, so make sure that you're paying attention to like the pattern in the table, right? So whatever percentage you figured out that you're getting each month, okay, in this case, again, we had to split that 2% evenly over the 12 months, and that same number gets used in every single calculation that we do, right? For each line, we're taking that same percentage. The only thing that's changing is our starting balance, right? So each time, at the end of each month, whatever that ending balance is, that's your new starting amount, right? And that's what you're calculating your interest off of. And when you get your new interest, that just gets added back on to what you started with for that month. Okay, so I'm hoping you see the pattern here, because now I'm going to ask you guys to try one on your own. So it says you deposit $1,000 into a savings account that earns an annual interest rate of 4% compounded annually. Okay, so the fact that this says that it's compounded annually, that means you get that 4% at the end of each year. Okay, so how much will you have in your account after 3 years? I'm going to ask you guys to take out a piece of paper, copy down this chart. Okay, remember that your starting balance is going to be that $1,000, and again, this is compounded annually, not monthly, so you don't have to change that 4%. That's what you're using as you calculate 4% after a year. Find that amount of interest, add it back on, and then continue that process. So we're looking for that final amount at the end of 3 years. Okay, so you're going to enter in that number when you have worked that out, and then make sure that you're bringing that piece of paper with you back to class tomorrow. And so once you're done with that, then you can answer the last questions at the end. Okay, and so to wrap up, I'd like you guys to please write down or record something you learned or were reminded of, and any questions that you might have. All right, thanks for watching.